In Charleston County, South Carolina, a blood-stained confession letter surfaced in 1847, hidden within the walls of a demolished plantation manor. Written in two distinct handwritings, the document detailed the murder of an enslaved woman named Patience and the systematic cover-up that followed. What made authorities seal the case file for 70 years was not just the described brutality, but the identity of the second writer, a child no older than 8, whose testimony contradicted every official record. Citing matters of civic reputation, the Charleston Historical Society refused to comment on the letter's authenticity until 1923. Tonight, we reveal what that little girl saw in the barn on August 14, 1834, and why the truth was buried deeper than any grave. But before we continue with the story of Magnolia Ridge Plantation, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, the ones they tried to erase from history, need to be told. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my audience is discovering these dark chapters of American history. The documents we're about to discuss were only declassified after the last living descendant of the Rutledge family died without heirs, releasing their private papers to the state archives. Sitting 12 miles inland from Charleston, Magnolia Ridge was far enough from the coastal humidity to grow decent tobacco, but close enough to the port for profitable export. In 1834, it was one of 43 plantations operating in the county, neither the largest nor the smallest, employing 62 enslaved people across 400 acres. Built in 1809, the manor house featured the fashionable Greek Revival columns that every ambitious planter wanted, white paint that blistered under the relentless sun, and a reputation for stability that made it unremarkable among its peers. Samuel Rutledge inherited the property from his father in 1828 at age 31. Unlike some of the more flamboyant planters who spent seasons in Charleston society, Samuel preferred the routine of agricultural management. He kept meticulous records, purchased quality breeding stock, and maintained what he called reasonable discipline among his workforce. His wife Catherine had died giving birth to their only son, Thomas, in 1830, leaving Samuel to raise the boy with help from his widowed sister, Margaret, who moved into the manor that same year. The plantation operated under the conventional hierarchy of the time. An overseer named Dutch Calloway, hired from Georgia in 1832, managed the field hands. The cooking and cleaning were handled by 2 house servants, elderly women named Bess and Clara. Their days measured by the relentless South Carolina sun and the overseer's bell, the rest worked the tobacco fields. Among those 62 souls was Patience Drummond, 26 years old, who'd been born on the property. Records listed her as a capable field hand, with no known complications. But those who knew her remembered something else, a singing voice, clear and haunting, that carried across the fields during harvest. She had a daughter, Ruby, born in 1826, whose father's name appeared nowhere in the plantation books. This wasn't unusual, many such silences existed in those pages. Starting at age 6, Ruby worked in the manor house, learning basic household tasks under Bess's instruction. Small for her age and quiet, she had her mother's dark eyes and a habit of watching everything with an intensity that made some uncomfortable. Samuel Rutledge had approved her transfer from fieldwork, noting in his ledger that the girl shows aptitude for domestic service and may prove valuable in that capacity. The summer of 1834 was particularly brutal. For 18 consecutive days in July, temperatures climbed above 95 degrees, and 2 elderly field workers died from what the plantation doctor called heat apoplexy. The tobacco crop suffered, leaves yellowing prematurely, and Dutch Calloway grew increasingly irritable, extending work hours and reducing water breaks. Across Magnolia Ridge, tensions simmered like the heat waves rising from the red clay. In the big house, 8-year-old Thomas Rutledge spent his days with a tutor imported from Charleston, learning Latin and mathematics while his father reviewed accounts in the study. The boy had his mother's fair coloring and his father's serious demeanor, already showing signs of the stern planter he was being groomed to become. During her duties, Ruby saw him often, this other child, whose world existed in the same physical space as hers, yet remained impossibly distant. The household was managed with firm efficiency by Margaret Rutledge, 38 years old. She'd never married, and gossip suggested a broken engagement in her youth, but she never spoke of it. Instead, She channeled her energies into making Magnolia Ridge a model of Southern domesticity, at least within the manor's walls. She inspected Ruby's work with a critical eye, correcting the placement of silverware and the folding of linens, but never raised her voice, maintaining the cool courtesy that Charleston society demanded. The barn, where everything would happen, sat 200 yards behind the manor house, a substantial structure of pine planked over oak framing that housed workhorses, equipment, and served as storage for tools and seed. A loft accessible by ladder held hay and other supplies. In one corner, Dutch Calloway maintained a small office, little more than a desk and chair where he kept his records, and according to later testimony, a bottle of whiskey hidden in a grain barrel. Assigned to evening barn duties that August was patience, feeding and watering the horses after field work ended. This was lighter work than picking tobacco, and some speculated it was a kindness from Samuel Rutledge, though his ledgers mentioned only reassignment due to declining field productivity. She would arrive at dusk, spend an hour with the animals, then return to the slave quarters, a row of small cabins visible from the manor's second-floor windows. Life at Magnolia Ridge followed the patterns established over decades across the South, a carefully maintained hierarchy where everyone knew their place and the consequences of forgetting it. The work was hard but predictable, the punishments harsh, but not unusually so by the standards of 1834. Samuel Rutledge considered himself a reasonable man, better than some of his neighbors, not as soft as others. He attended church on Sundays, paid his debts, and expected the same order from his household that he maintained in his ledgers. Nothing in those carefully ruled columns suggested that within days, blood would stain the barn floor. Nothing in the peaceful routine of morning bells and evening prayers indicated that a child would witness something that would haunt her for 70 years. The documents would show that Ruby was supposed to be asleep in the house servants' quarters that night. Instead, she'd gone looking for her mother. August 14, 1834 began like any other Thursday at Magnolia Ridge. The sun rose at 5:47 a.m. and Dutch Calloway's bell rang 15 minutes later, summoning the field workers from their cabins. Patience Drummond joined the line, heading toward the tobacco fields, her daughter watching from the manor house kitchen window as Bess kneaded dough for the morning's biscuits. The temperature was already climbing toward what would be another scorching day. Ruby's duties that morning included helping Bess with breakfast service, polishing the silver in the dining room, and beating dust from the parlor rugs. She performed these tasks mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The night before, she'd overheard Dutch Calloway telling Samuel Rutledge that Patience had been slacking in her evening duties, leaving the barn before all tasks were completed. Ruby had seen her mother's exhaustion, the way she'd been moving slower lately, holding her side as if something hurt there. The day progressed in oppressive heat. By afternoon, 3 more field workers had collapsed, requiring the plantation doctor to be summoned from his rounds at a neighboring property. Pacing his study, Samuel Rutledge calculated the cost of lost labor against the value of potentially damaged workers. Dutch Calloway sent word that he was extending the workday by an hour to make up for lost time. Through the slave quarters, the decision rippled with silent dread. Patience returned from the fields at 7:30 p.m., her dress soaked through with sweat, red clay caked on her bare feet. From the second-floor landing where she was dusting banisters, Ruby saw her. She watched her mother pause at the well to drink deeply before heading toward the barn. There was something in Patience's posture, a heaviness beyond physical exhaustion that made Ruby uneasy. What happened next, we know from multiple sources: the confession letter, testimony given 30 years later, and physical evidence documented when the barn was finally examined in 1847. The accounts don't always align perfectly, but certain facts remain undisputed. At approximately 8:15 p.m., as dusk settled over Magnolia Ridge, Ruby finished her duties and was sent to the servants' quarters to sleep. Instead, driven by a worry she couldn't fully articulate, she circled back toward the barn. The sky had turned that particular purple-gray of southern twilight, and cicadas were beginning their evening chorus. She approached quietly, as enslaved children learned to move, making herself small and unobtrusive. The barn's main door stood partially open and lamplight spilled from within. She could hear voices, 2 of them, one her mother's, pleading, and another that made her stomach clench with fear. Ruby crept to the side of the barn where gaps between the planks allowed slivers of vision. What she saw would be described in her own handwriting 40 years later, when arthritis had twisted her fingers but not erased her memory. Inside the barn, Patience stood near the horse stalls, backed against the wall. Dutch Calloway faced her, blocking the door. His voice was slurred, the whiskey bottle visible on his makeshift desk. He was speaking about her disrespect, about teaching a lesson, about things Ruby was too young to fully understand, but old enough to fear. Patience was trying to talk her way out, using the careful deferential tone that survival demanded. "Mr. Calloway, sir, I done all the work you asked. The horses is fed and watered. The stalls is mucked. Everything like you wanted. You questioning me?" His voice rose. "You saying I'm a liar?" "No, sir. I ain't saying nothing like that. I just..." The first blow came fast, his fist connecting with Patience's jaw with a sound Ruby would hear in nightmares for the rest of her life. Her mother stumbled, tried to catch herself on the stall door, and Calloway hit her again, this time in the ribs. Ruby's child mind screamed at her to run, to get help, to do something, but she was frozen, small fingers gripping the rough barn wood, unable to look away or move forward. She watched her mother fall, watched Calloway kick her once, twice, watched Patience try to curl into herself for protection. Then came the moment that would define everything that followed. Samuel Rutledge appeared in the barn doorway. For one crystalline instant, Ruby thought salvation had arrived. The master would stop this. He would protect her mother. That's what the carefully maintained myth of paternalistic plantation management promised, wasn't it? That masters were cruel but just, harsh, but protective of their property. Samuel Rutledge stood in that doorway for perhaps 5 seconds, taking in the scene, his overseer, drunk and violent, his enslaved worker bleeding on the barn floor. His niece's words from dinner echoed in that space. "You're too soft with them, uncle. Father always said discipline maintains order." What Ruby saw in his face wasn't anger at Calloway. It was calculation. "She attacked you." Samuel Rutledge said it. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. Dutch Calloway, breathing hard, seemed to understand immediately. "Yes, sir. Came at me with a pitchfork. Had to defend myself." Patience tried to speak, blood bubbling from her lips. "No, Master Samuel, please. I never." But Samuel Rutledge had already turned away, his decision made. "Do what's necessary to restore order, Mr. Calloway. I'll inform the house staff there was an incident. An unfortunate incident." He walked out of the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel path back toward the manor house. Dutch Calloway looked down at Patience, and something shifted in his expression. With the master's implicit permission, he no longer needed to restrain himself. Ruby watched her mother die. The details are too brutal to recount in full, and the confession letter's second writer, the 8-year-old child, Ruby, struggled to find words for what she witnessed. She wrote of sounds, the wet crack of something breaking inside, of her mother's singing voice reduced to gasping whimpers, of the barn cats fleeing from the smell of blood. She wrote of standing paralyzed by horror and the knowledge that screaming would mean her own death. When it was over, when Patience Drummond's body lay still in the blood-soaked straw, Dutch Calloway stood over her, breathing hard. He took a long drink from his whiskey bottle. Then he looked directly at the gap in the barn wall where Ruby's eye had been pressed. "I see you, girl." Ruby ran. She ran through the darkening plantation grounds, past the slave quarters where people had learned not to hear screaming, past the well where her mother had taken her last drink of water, toward the only refuge an 8-year-old enslaved child could imagine, the big house where Master Thomas slept, where Aunt Margaret maintained order, where surely someone would help. She stumbled through the kitchen door where Bess was banking the fires for the night. The old woman's face went pale as Ruby burst in, covered in barn dust and terror. "Child, what?" "Master killed my mama in the barn." The words tumbled out, truth unfiltered by strategy or survival instinct. "Master Samuel was there, and he told Mr. Calloway to do it, and my mom was dead, and he saw me watching, and..." Bess's hand clamped over Ruby's mouth, cutting off the flood of words. For a moment, the two of them stood frozen in the kitchen's residual heat, the old woman's eyes full of a fear that mirrored Ruby's own. "You listen to me," Bess whispered, her voice shaking. "You don't say them words again, you hear me? Not ever. Not if you want to live to see morning. But it was too late. Samuel Rutledge stood in the kitchen doorway, Margaret beside him, both having heard every word. Thomas, in his nightshirt, peered around his aunt's skirts, curious about the commotion. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Samuel Rutledge's face was unreadable, the same expression he wore when reviewing accounts or calculating crop yields. He was solving a problem, Ruby realized with the clarity of absolute terror. She was a problem that needed solving. "The child is hysterical," he said finally, addressing Margaret. "She's had a shock. Her mother suffered an accident in the barn, resisted discipline, and met with tragedy. The overseer was defending himself against assault. Tragic, but necessary. The girl, however," he looked at Ruby with eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, only cold assessment, "the girl is making dangerous accusations." Margaret Rutledge's hand tightened on her nephew Thomas's shoulder. "What are you suggesting, Samuel? She saw nothing. She understands nothing. She'll be locked in the cellar tonight while we determine what's to be done." He turned to Bess. "Take her down. Don't let her speak to anyone." As Bess's trembling hands pulled Ruby toward the cellar stairs, the child began to scream, the sound that had been trapped in her throat since watching her mother's murder finally erupting. She screamed her mother's name, screamed the truth, screamed accusations that would have gotten any adult enslaved person killed immediately. Thomas Rutledge, 8 years old and sheltered from the plantation's brutal realities, asked the question that would haunt him for decades. "Aunt Margaret, why is Ruby crying? Where's her memoir?" Margaret's response was cut off as Bess dragged Ruby down into the darkness of the cellar, a stone-walled space that smelled of earth and potatoes, where the child's screams would be muffled by thick walls and the willful deafness of everyone who heard them. Above, in the barn, Dutch Calloway was cleaning up the evidence of what he would forever claim was self-defense against a violent enslaved woman. The pitchfork he placed near Patience's body had never been touched by her hands. The marks on his own face, which he carefully inflicted on himself, would corroborate his story. And in his study, Samuel Rutledge dipped his pen in ink and began writing the official account in his plantation ledger. August 14, 1834. Enslaved woman Patience Drummond, age 26, killed while attacking overseer Dutch Calloway with farming implement. Necessary force employed to subdue aggressor. Daughter Ruby, aged 8, witnessed aftermath and became hysterical. Matter resolved according to law. Total property loss, one field hand valued at $600. The numbers didn't lie, Samuel Rutledge believed. Numbers were clean, orderly, free from the messy complications of truth. In the cellar, Ruby Drummond huddled in the darkness and understood, with the terrible wisdom of traumatized children, that she had just learned what her life was worth. Morning light filtered weakly through the cellar's single high window when Bess returned, carrying a tin cup of water and a piece of cornbread. Ruby hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, kept seeing her mother's face in the darkness. The old woman's hands shook as she set down the meager breakfast. "Child, you listen carefully now," Bess whispered, glancing nervously toward the cellar stairs. "Master Samuels called for the magistrate. Says there needs to be an official inquiry into what happened. Dutch Calloway done told his version already. Says your memoir tried to kill him and he defended himself. Says you ain't seen nothing but the aftermath, that you're making up stories 'cause you're grieving. But I saw." "It don't matter what you saw," Bess's voice cracked. "You 8 years old and enslaved. Judge ain't going to believe nothing you say against a white overseer. And if you keep telling your story, if you keep saying Master Samuel was there," she couldn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to." The magistrate, Judge Edmund Pritchard, arrived at 10 o'clock that morning, riding up the oak-lined drive in his carriage. He was 56 years old, had presided over Charleston County for 18 years, and owned a small plantation of his own 20 miles south. He and Samuel Rutledge belonged to the same gentleman's club in Charleston, attended the same church, moved in the same social circles. The inquiry, such as it was, took place in Samuel Rutledge's study. Dutch Calloway presented his account first, standing with his hat in his hands, his face showing the scratches he'd inflicted on himself the night before. He spoke of Patience's insolent behavior, her refusal to complete assigned tasks, and finally her violent assault with a pitchfork when he confronted her about her defiance. "I feared for my life, Your Honor," Calloway said, his voice steady. "She came at me like a wild animal. I had no choice but to defend myself. It's a tragedy, truly, but a man has a right to protect himself." Judge Pritchard made notes in a leather-bound book. Were there witnesses to this assault? "The girl, Ruby, came to the barn after it was over. Found her mama dead and, well, she's a child. Can't rightly understand what happened. Been telling all sorts of wild stories, saying things that ain't true. Grief talking, I reckon." Samuel Rutledge corroborated the overseer's timeline, carefully omitting his own presence in the barn. "I heard a commotion, investigated afterward, found Calloway shaken but unharmed, and the woman deceased. The girl was hysterical, as Mr. Calloway said, making accusations that are simply impossible. And these accusations are..." Samuel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She claims I was present during the incident and somehow complicit, the ravings of a traumatized child, nothing more. I was in my study reviewing accounts at the time in question. My sister can verify this." Margaret Rutledge, called to testify, confirmed her brother's alibi without meeting Judge Pritchard's eyes. Samuel was indeed in his study. "I brought him tea at 8 o'clock and saw him working there. I heard nothing unusual until the girl came running into the house screaming about her mother." The judge closed his notebook. "I see no reason to pursue this matter further. A tragic incident of justified force against violent resistance. Mr. Calloway acted within his rights as overseer. The enslaved woman's death, while regrettable, appears lawful." He looked at Samuel. "The girl will need to be managed carefully. Such accusations, even from a child, can be problematic. She'll be dealt with appropriately," Samuel assured him. Ruby, still locked in the cellar, was never called to give testimony. In the legal framework of 1834 South Carolina, her words had no weight, no validity, no power to contradict the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. But someone else had heard her screams the night before. Thomas Rutledge, the 8-year-old heir to Magnolia Ridge, couldn't forget Ruby's voice crying out her accusations. The boy had been raised to accept the social order of plantation life as natural and divinely ordained, but something about Ruby's terror had disturbed him deeply. She was close to his own age, someone he'd seen nearly every day of his life, and now she was locked in the cellar like a criminal. That afternoon, while his father met with Judge Pritchard and his aunt supervised the preparation of Patience's body for burial in the slave cemetery, Thomas slipped down to the cellar. Ruby sat in the corner, hugging her knees, tear tracks dried on her dusty face. She looked up as lamplight preceded the boy down the stairs, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, two children divided by everything their society considered immutable. "Did you really see what happened?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby's first instinct was to deny everything, to recant, to say whatever would keep her alive. But looking at Thomas's face, so similar to her own in its youth and confusion, something broke inside her. She told him the truth. Every detail, her mother's pleas, Dutch Calloway's violence, and most damning of all, Samuel Rutledge's moment of choice in the barn doorway. Thomas listened in growing horror. But father wouldn't. He's always saying we have responsibilities to our people, that we treat them fairly. "Your father watched my mama die," Ruby said, her voice hollow. "And then he walked away." The boy's face went pale. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend his father. But the words wouldn't come because some part of him, the part that hadn't yet been fully molded by the system he'd inherit, recognized truth when he heard it. "I have to go," he said finally, backing toward the stairs. "If they catch me here." "Master Thomas," Ruby called after him, using the title that reinforced the gulf between them, even as she sought his help. "Please, they're going to sell me, or worse. Don't let them. Please." Thomas fled up the stairs without answering, but Ruby's plea haunted him. That night, he did something that would eventually lead to the confession letter's discovery 113 years later. He began keeping a secret journal, recording everything he'd heard and witnessed, his child's handwriting documenting truths that the official records would erase. Patience Drummond was buried the next day in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery, a plot of land beyond the tobacco fields where the plantation's enslaved workers rested without headstones or ceremony. The burial was quick, perfunctory. Samuel Rutledge did not attend, but he did note the expense of lost work time in his ledger. Ruby remained in the cellar for 3 more days while her fate was decided. Samuel Rutledge consulted with other planters about how to handle an enslaved child who had witnessed something she shouldn't have, and worse, had spoken about it. The consensus was troubling. Such a witness was dangerous. Her very existence a threat to the carefully maintained order. Several options were discussed. Selling her would simply move the problem elsewhere, and her story might spread. Harsh punishment might silence her, but could also make her a martyr among the other enslaved workers. What was needed, the planters agreed, was a solution that would be both effective and maintain the facade of benevolent paternalism. Margaret Rutledge provided the answer. On the 4th day of Ruby's imprisonment, Margaret descended the cellar stairs carrying a clean dress and a wash basin. She set them down and regarded the child with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, simply pragmatic. "You'll be staying in the house permanently now," Margaret announced. "You'll have a small room off the kitchen, better than the quarters. Your duties will increase, but so will your privileges. Better food, warmer shelter. But there are conditions." Ruby said nothing, understanding that no response was expected. "You will never speak of what you think you saw in that barn. Not to the other servants, not to visiting guests, not to anyone. Ever. If you do, you'll be sold to a plantation in Georgia where they work rice fields in snake-infested swamps, and you'll be dead within a year. Do you understand?" "Yes, More than that," Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower. "You will actively support the official version of events. If anyone asks, you arrived after the incident, you saw your mother's body and assumed wrongly that something improper had occurred. Your grief made you irrational. You understand now that Mr. Calloway acted in self-defense. Can you say that?" Ruby's mouth went dry. To survive, she would have to become complicit in her mother's murder, would have to speak words that betrayed Patience's memory. But what choice did an 8-year-old enslaved child have? "I can say that," she whispered. "Good, then we understand each other." Margaret turned to leave, but paused at the stairs. "Your mother's death was unfortunate. But order must be maintained. You're intelligent enough to understand that, I think. Intelligence can be a curse or a gift, Ruby. The choice of which it becomes is yours." The room off the kitchen where Ruby was installed measured perhaps 8 feet by 6, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk for her belongings, but it had a door that closed, a window that opened, and most importantly, it was in the main house under Margaret Rutledge's direct supervision. Ruby would be watched constantly, her every word monitored, her every action scrutinized. Life at Magnolia Ridge returned to its routines. The tobacco was harvested. Dutch Calloway continued as overseer, his authority unchallenged. Judge Pritchard's official report declared the matter closed. And Ruby Drummond, 8 years old and orphaned, learned to perform her new role, the grateful enslaved child who had been shown mercy after false accusations born of grief. But late at night, in that small room off the kitchen, Ruby would press her ear to the wall and listen to the house settling, to Margaret's footsteps above, to Samuel Rutledge's voice discussing business matters with visitors. She listened and she remembered, storing every detail in a memory that would prove more permanent than the official records. And in his room on the 2nd floor, Thomas Rutledge continued his secret journal, writing in a child's hand about the night Ruby came screaming into the house, about the story she'd told him in the cellar, about the doubt that had taken root in his heart regarding his father's character. The 2 children, separated by the vast gulf of their circumstances, were unknowingly documenting the truth that adults had worked so hard to bury. Years would pass before their written words would converge in that confession letter. Decades would elapse before anyone would read what they'd recorded. But the truth, once witnessed, is never truly destroyed. It simply waits.